It's been 40 years since The Breakfast Club hit theaters and became an instant classic. The movie stole the hearts of many with its amazing plot and effortless humor. However, it turns out some dark and disturbing things may have been going on behind the scenes of the movie. Molly Ringwald, who played the iconic Claire Standish, has finally opened up about the extremely shocking and disturbing truth behind the film. And let's just say, it's not all sunshine and nostalgia. Molly's revelations are making headlines, and after you hear them, you'll never see The Breakfast Club the same way again. What did she say? And does she have regrets? Let's break it all down. Molly Ringwald's rise to the top. Do you know that Molly Ringwald was just 16 years old when she starred as Claire, the rich popular girl forced to spend a Saturday in detention with a bunch of misfits? At the time, it's safe to say she was Hollywood's it teen actress, having already worked with director John Hughes on the iconic 16 Candles. But what fans might not know is that Molly wasn't even the first choice for the role of Claire, and you're about to find out why. You see, before she became the queen of 80s teen movies, Molly Ringwald was just a small-town girl with big dreams, and her journey to the center of attraction in Hollywood wasn't exactly smooth. Molly Kathleen Ringwald was born on February 18, 1968, in Roseville, California, and from the very start, she had showbiz in her blood. Her father, Bob Ringwald, was a blind jazz pianist, and her love for performing started at a young age. At just 5 years old, Molly recorded an album with her dad's band called I Wanna Be Loved by You. Yup, that's right. While most kids her age were playing with toys, Molly was already singing professionally. But music wasn't the only thing she was good at. At that same age, Molly started her acting career by appearing in a stage production of Alice in Wonderland as the Dormouse. By the time she was 6, she was acting in local theater productions, and by 10, she landed a role in a West Coast production of Annie. Clearly, she was a natural, but getting to Hollywood? That was a whole different challenge. Molly also joined the new Mickey Mouse Club, not the one Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake were part of, but the 1977 version. Not long after, she landed a recurring role on the sitcom The Facts of Life, where she played Molly Parker, a quirky, outspoken student at Eastland Academy. Now, here's the crazy part. Even though she was a fan favorite, the producers of the show fired her after just one season. Their reason? Well, they said that they wanted to revamp the entire show, and that the cast was too big and decided to cut not just her character, but several others. With the way Hollywood works, that could have been the end of her career, but instead, it opened the door to something even bigger. Molly's Facts of Life firing may have turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because shortly after, she auditioned for a new teen movie written by a guy named John Hughes. That movie was 16 Candles. At the time, John Hughes was just a magazine writer trying to break into Hollywood. He had written 16 Candles with one actress in mind, Molly Ringwald. Why? Because while casting, someone showed him a picture of 14-year-old Molly, and he was immediately convinced that she was the one for the role of Samantha. Without even meeting her, Hughes basically hand-picked her for the lead role by merely looking at her headshot. Talk about fate. The film was a massive hit, grossing over $23 million against a budget of $6.5 million. The reception in the United States and Canada was amazing, with the popular review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes reporting that 81% of critics gave it a positive rating. And just like that, Molly was everywhere. Fans of the movie absolutely loved her, and let's be real, it wasn't hard to see why they did. But her biggest role was still ahead of her. After 16 Candles, John Hughes was already working on his next project, a movie about 5 teenagers stuck in Saturday detention named The Breakfast Club. He had the script for the movie, but there was a problem. John wasn't quite sure who would play the roles. However, Towards the end of filming 16 Candles, he came up with the bright idea of having Molly star in his new project. But do you know that Molly was initially approached to play the character of Allison Reynolds, the quiet goth girl, eventually played by Ali Sheedy? Yup, you heard correctly. She wasn't supposed to play the role of Claire. However, Molly was really upset because she wanted to play the role of Claire Standish instead. And typical? Molly never takes no for an answer, so she eventually convinced John and the studio to audition her for the part of Claire. And immediately when John saw her read, he had a change of heart. And just like that, she landed the role that would define her career forever. But just because she got the part doesn't mean it was easy. Molly was only 16 years old when filming began. While the rest of the cast were in their 20s, she was the only one who was still an actual teenager. And that made things a little intimidating. There were several disturbing things going on behind the scenes that the media could not see. There was also a lot of pressure on her to look perfect. The studio wanted her to have the ultimate rich girl style, so they gave her expensive designer clothes to wear on set that she didn't quite like. Still, she was fully committed to the role, and when the cameras rolled, she became Claire Standish. When The Breakfast Club premiered in 1985, nobody expected it to become one of the greatest teen movies of all time. But something about it just clicked with audiences. The way the characters talked, the way they felt so real. It was different from the cheesy teen comedies that had come before. And Molly? She was the perfect Claire. She had it all. Cool, confident, and yet secretly vulnerable. Fans loved it even more because they related to her character more than they expected. Sure, she was a rich girl, but she also had insecurities, pressures, and struggles just like everyone else. And that's what made her stand out. After The Breakfast Club, Molly was officially Hollywood's biggest teen star. She was crowned the leader of the Brat Pack, a group of young actors that included Emilio Estevez, Judd Nelson, Ali Sheedy, Rob Lowe, and Demi Moore. She went on to star in Pretty in Pink, another John Hughes classic, and by 1987, she was one of the highest-paid young actresses in Hollywood. But just as quickly as she rose to fame, she disappeared from the Hollywood scene at the peak of her career. This move shocked the entire entertainment industry, especially her fans, leaving them with one question: why? Well, it turns out that her reasons for leaving the Hollywood scene are quite disturbing and shocking and are related to her experiences on various film sets, including The Breakfast Club. Molly Ringwald's disappearance from the spotlight. Molly's decision to leave Hollywood is tied to several factors. But first, it is important to understand that by the late 1980s, she had starred in back-to-back hits, making her one of the most successful young actresses of her time. But while these movies made her a household name, they also became somewhat of a curse. Because once Hollywood saw her as the sweet, awkward, coming-of-age girl, they refused to see her as anything else. And unfortunately, if there's one thing Hollywood is known for, it's putting actors into neat little boxes. Instead of seeing Molly as a versatile actress capable of playing anything, they decided she could only be one thing. That's the teenage dream girl of the 80s, and that's where the problem started. Molly's career should have grown after The Breakfast Club wrapped up. As a matter of fact, she should have gotten the chance to take on more complex adult roles. But instead, it was almost as if the industry shut her out. Meanwhile, her male co-stars had no problem moving on. Emilio Estevez landed major roles in films like Young Guns, The Mighty Ducks, and even Mission Impossible. Judd Nelson transitioned into grittier roles in New Jack City and Suddenly Susan. Another male co-star, Anthony Michael Hall, eventually found his way into more dramatic and action roles, even starring in The Dark Knight. Yet, when it came to Molly, Hollywood wasn't exactly interested. She was dealing with an unfair double-standard situation, where young male actors were given the chance to evolve. But for young women, once they aged out of their cute teenage phase, they were tossed aside. And the situation was especially worse for actresses who had become famous in high school roles, because the industry didn't know what to do with them once they reached adulthood. To producers and directors, Molly didn't come across as an adult actress. To them, she was still the fresh-faced 16-year-old from John Hughes movies. But at the time, Molly didn't realize what was happening. In a later interview, she opened up about her experience, saying, "I was projected as this perfect, sweet American girl next door, which wasn't me, but I was figuring out who I was, too. I was pretty young." Molly wanted to break out of the teen genre. She actively looked for mature, dramatic roles that would show her range. However, every time, the industry sent her a clear message that she was too young for adult roles, too old for teen movies, and too famous for smaller indie films. And just like that, her career stalled. Things got even worse when she was offered the lead role in the iconic film Pretty Woman. Yes, Molly was actually the original choice to play Vivian, the role that ultimately made Julia Roberts a superstar. However, she shocked everyone when she turned it down. At the time, the script's original version was much darker, and she wasn't comfortable playing the role of a prostitute. She wasn't sure how the movie would turn out, and so she passed. Julia Roberts took the role and became an A-list Hollywood icon, while Molly's career faded even further. Looking back, she later admitted that she turned down Pretty Woman because the storyline was icky. And who knows, that may have been the moment that Hollywood completely gave up on her. Because after that, the phone calls stopped coming. And so, by the early 90s, Molly had two choices. She could take the roles Hollywood kept offering her, or she could step away from Hollywood and do something different. She chose the second option. She packed her bags and moved to France, where she could escape the pressures of Hollywood and live a normal life. Instead of chasing roles, she focused on writing, raising a family, and exploring other passions. But that's not the only reason why Molly Ringwald disappeared from the movie industry. You see, long before the #MeToo movement exposed the toxic culture of Hollywood, Molly had already lived it. In interviews, she has spoken about the unfortunate predatory behavior she experienced as a young actress. Being introduced to the spotlight at a very early age also meant that she was constantly surrounded by powerful men, some of whom saw young women as nothing more than objects. Unfortunately, sometimes Hollywood had no boundaries when it came to young stars, and Molly had to figure out that in Hollywood there was no such thing as childhood innocence. The industry expects teenage actresses to be mature beyond their years, and unfortunately, that often means being put in uncomfortable situations. Molly later revealed that one of the reasons she left was because, as a young actress, she was constantly put in uncomfortable and inappropriate situations with powerful men. In an interview, she even recalled some vivid examples of her experiences while noting that at the time, she didn't know how to react to it. She also suggested that directors and producers would often test her boundaries, making comments that no teenage girl should have to hear. The worst part of it all was the fact that it was so common that no one saw it as unusual. She once said, "I was taken advantage of. You can't be a young actress in Hollywood and not have predators around." It was an era where young actresses were expected to stay quiet. If they spoke up, they risked being labeled difficult, which meant fewer roles, fewer opportunities, and, ultimately, the end of their careers. So, like many others, Molly kept quiet. Perhaps one of the most damaging aspects of Hollywood's culture is the idea that young actresses should feel lucky just to be there. Molly was constantly made to feel like she was one of the chosen few, and that millions of girls would do anything to be in her position. That kind of pressure made it even harder to speak out. This meant that if something made her uncomfortable, she was expected to laugh it off, If someone in power crossed a line, she was supposed to brush it aside. At the time, she didn't fully understand how wrong it all was, but as she got older, she started to see things more clearly. And so when the Me Too movement gained momentum, Molly finally started to open up about what she had experienced. Although she didn't tell every story or call out specific names, she made it clear that she too had been a victim of the same predatory culture that so many actresses before and after her had faced. Well, Molly has made it super clear that she doesn't regret stepping away from Hollywood. She saw what happened to other actresses, how the industry used them, discarded them, and then forgot about them. And while she may have lost out on some fame and fortune at that time, she definitely gained something even more valuable in the form of her peace, dignity, and her ability to control her own narrative. But looking back now, at the age of 57, what does Molly Ringwald really think about The Breakfast Club? Does she regret the role? And were shocking things going on behind the scenes the entire time? Molly's reflections on The Breakfast Club. When The Breakfast Club hit theaters back in 1985, it became an instant classic and a film that defined an entire generation. But now, decades later, Molly Ringwald has finally confessed that she has mixed feelings about the movie. She's proud of it. She knows how much it means to people. But there are things about it that, looking back, make her uncomfortable. One of the biggest issues Molly has with the movie is one particular scene that many fans remember, but not for the right reasons. It's the infamous scene where John Bender, played by Judd Nelson, hides under Claire's desk. While the movie plays it off as a rebellious, comedic moment, the reality is much darker. As Bender sits under the desk, he peeks at Claire inappropriately. And although the film doesn't explicitly show it, it strongly implies some inappropriate behavior. At the time, audiences laughed it off as just another example of Bender being a troublemaker. But decades later, Molly has a very different take. She has made it clear that this scene would never be acceptable today, and rightfully so. At the time, it was treated as flirty tension between the characters. But now, she sees it as an example of how Hollywood normalized uncomfortable and inappropriate behavior toward women, especially young women. In an interview, she said, "I kept thinking about that scene. I thought about it again this past fall, after a number of women came forward with intimate harassment accusations against the producer, Harvey Weinstein, and the hashtag #MeToo movement gathered steam. If attitudes toward female subjugation are systemic, and I believe that they are, it stands to reason that the art we consume and sanction plays some part in reinforcing those same attitudes." Another disturbing fact about that scene was the fact that because Molly was not legally an adult at the time, the studio had to use a body double to film some moments of the scene. Even though this was technically the legal way to handle the situation, Molly thinks that the entire thing made her and her family extremely uncomfortable. To her, this is just another example of how young actresses were put in uncomfortable positions in Hollywood, and no one questioned it at the time. Another thing that doesn't sit right with Molly is the fact that throughout the movie, Bender's interactions with Claire are bold, teasing, and full of strong remarks. He challenges her, makes sharp comments, and pushes her buttons. At one point, he even accuses her of being a tease, which is meant to reflect the tension between them. In the 80s, this type of dynamic was often seen as exciting. You know, the idea that the rebellious guy and the polished girl would eventually fall for each other. But now, Molly sees it in a different way, one that sends the wrong message. Although Molly has a deep appreciation for the director of the show, John Hughes, she also acknowledges that some of his choices would be seen differently today. In a 2018 essay for The New Yorker, she confessed that while she admired John Hughes's sensitivity in portraying teenage girls, he definitely had a glaring blind spot in his writing regarding how those girls were treated by the boys around them, particularly in The Breakfast Club. Hughes was a master at capturing teenage emotions, But there were moments where his scripts included problematic scenes that weren't quite necessary. One of the biggest turning points for Molly came when she watched The Breakfast Club with her own daughter. For years, she had loved the film and focused on all the things it did right. But sitting next to her child, she suddenly saw it from a modern perspective. And it was at that moment that she realized just how much times have changed. She could see that certain moments weren't as lighthearted as they once seemed, and that if the film were made today, it would likely handle some things very differently. She said, "It's a strange experience watching a younger, more innocent version of yourself on screen. It's stranger still, surreal, even watching it with your child when she is much closer in age to that version of yourself than you are." My friend was right. My daughter didn't really seem to register most of the inappropriate stuff, though she did audibly gasp at some moments. Even though Molly has some reservations about The Breakfast Club, let's be real, she doesn't exactly regret being part of it. She still recognizes its cultural significance, and she understands why so many people connect with it. But she also believes that as time goes on, it's important to re-examine old movies and recognize when certain elements no longer feel right. But there's something else that didn't sit right with Molly during the entire filming process, and it was the way a particular co-star treated her. You see, The Breakfast Club is known for its incredible acting. Each actor brought raw energy to their role, making the characters feel like real teenagers trapped in an all-day detention session. But behind the scenes, not everything was as smooth as it seemed, and Molly had a particularly difficult time working with Judd Nelson, who played the rebellious John Bender. And a big part of that tension came from his commitment to method acting, a technique that pushed boundaries on and off screen. In The Breakfast Club, Bender is constantly pushing Claire's buttons, mocking her, teasing her, and challenging her in ways that range from playful to downright aggressive. But what made things difficult for Molly was that Nelson didn't stop being Bender when the cameras stopped rolling. According to reports from the set, he stayed in character even when they weren't filming, which meant he continued acting rude and aggressive toward Molly off-camera, all in an effort to stay fully immersed in the role. Of course, this didn't sit well with Molly, who was still quite young at the time. It wasn't just casual joking or playful banter. His intensity crossed a line, making the work environment very uncomfortable for her. As a matter of fact, director John Hughes even had to step in at one point because Nelson's behavior was becoming a serious issue. Things got so tense on set that John Hughes reportedly considered firing Judd Nelson. He felt that Nelson's commitment to the role was becoming disruptive, especially when it came to his interactions with Molly. At the time, Molly was the clear star of the film, and so when he saw that Nelson's off-screen behavior was affecting her, John Hughes wasn't happy about it. While he didn't ultimately fire Nelson, this situation added tension behind the scenes, making things even more difficult for Molly. While some actors in Hollywood embrace method acting till this very day, many others prefer to turn it on and off as needed, and Molly was definitely part of the latter group. She could slip into Claire's character when the cameras were rolling, but didn't feel the need to live as Claire when they weren't filming. For her, acting was about delivering an authentic performance while still maintaining a level of personal comfort. However, Nelson, on the other hand, decided to take a different approach. And there's no denying that Nelson's portrayal of Bender was powerful and memorable. However, looking back at it decades later, Molly doesn't dwell too much on the difficulties she faced while filming the show. She still acknowledges the film's impact and importance, and she's definitely proud of the work they all did. Well, just recently, there have been talks about the possibility of shooting The Breakfast Club reboot, or even a sequel. What does Molly think about it? Is she interested? The possibility of a reboot or sequel. When Molly was asked about a reboot of the iconic The Breakfast Club, her answer was a firm no. Well, She has strong feelings about why this 80s classic should be left alone. And honestly, she makes some pretty solid points. One of Molly's biggest arguments against a reboot is that The Breakfast Club captured a very specific moment in time that should not be altered by a reboot. When it was released in 1985, the movie spoke to an entire generation. It tackled teen angst, social cliques, and the pressure to fit in a way that felt raw and real. However, let's be real. Times have changed. Back then, high school was a different world. There were no smartphones, no social media, and no online personas shaping people's identities. Detention meant actually sitting in a room together, not scrolling on a phone, texting, or posting on TikTok. If The Breakfast Club were remade today, it would have to reflect modern teen life. And according to Molly, that wouldn't feel like the same story anymore. Another huge reason Molly isn't on board with a reboot is the sad fact that the movie was John Hughes's vision, and he's no longer here to guide it. John Hughes wasn't just the director. He was literally the heart and soul of the film. He understood teenagers in a way that few filmmakers did, and his writing was what made the movie so iconic. Molly has made it clear that she has immense respect for John and believes that without him, a reboot wouldn't feel right. She once said, "You can't reboot the John Hughes movies. He doesn't want it to be done, and I don't think it should be done." Okay, so maybe a remake wouldn't work, but what about a sequel? Could we revisit Claire, Bender, Andrew, Brian, and Allison as adults, now raising their own teenagers? Well, Molly doesn't think that would work either, and she believes it'll only dilute the strong memory the world has of the movie. And if we're being honest, one of the most beautiful things about the movie is that we never see what happens to them after detention. Did Claire and Bender stay together? Did Brian stop feeling like a misfit? Did Allison and Andrew make it as a couple? The film leaves it up to the audience to decide, and that's part of what makes it so powerful. A sequel would force answers to these questions, potentially ruining the mystery that makes the original so timeless. At the end of the day, Molly isn't against reboots in general. She understands that Hollywood loves to revisit old stories and that sometimes it actually works. But when it comes to The Breakfast Club, she firmly believes it's one of those rare movies that should be left alone. It was a lightning-in-a-bottle moment, a film that perfectly captured what it meant to be a teenager in the 80s. Molly believes that trying to recreate or continue that magic would be risky and possibly even disappointing. But what do you think? Is The Breakfast Club reboot a good idea? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the next one on your screen. You won't want to miss it.